The drug maker AstraZeneca is withdrawing its COVID-19 vaccine worldwide because it says of a surplus of other, newer, more effective vaccines. Demand for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine has declined because other shots that target the variants have been developed. AstraZeneca, in fact, no longer manufactures or supplies the vaccine, and it hasn't been available in Canada since December of last year. But it was an early vaccine in this country, the third vaccine approved by Health Canada at the time of the pandemic, and it started rolling out here in March of 2021. The company making the move, it says, because of business issues, consumer issues, but there's another part to the story, which we're going to talk about with Dr. Samir Gupta, who's here in studio, as he is on Wednesdays, respirologist and an associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Welcome back. How many times did we talk about AstraZeneca in the early days? And we're throwing back to that. The other part of the story, so it's pulling it from the vaccine. 150 countries use the AstraZeneca vaccine. Canada was one of them. And it's pulling it off the market worldwide. For consumer reasons, there are other better vaccines, but also, in court documents which the company filed, it was revealed for the first time that the company admitted to some serious side effects with its vaccine. What was the new information?
I mean, it's not new to the scientific community,
right,
but it's new that the companies acknowledged it because they are facing lawsuits around this complication. And so this is what we call VITT, or VITT, vaccine-induced thrombotic thrombocytopenia. So the thrombotic part refers to clotting. Thrombosis is clot. Thrombocytopenia refers to low platelets. So this is a syndrome where people form clots in their body and their platelet levels are low. Those are sort of the hallmarks. That's how we identify this. And it was identified that ultimately we figured out scientifically how this happens and why this happens, but it was identified that these are what we call viral vector vaccines. This vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they use a virus to get the genetic material of the spike protein into our bodies so that our cells then make the spike protein, we form antibodies, we're protected. In about 1 in 50,000 people, rarely this happens, where what will happen is the adenovirus, that viral vector, will bind to an element in our blood called PF4, platelet factor 4. So this is a naturally occurring part of our clotting cascade, which actually activates our platelets. Platelets are those little cells that form clots.
Right.
So you get a cut, your platelet factor 4 levels go up locally, tells the platelets to form a clot, it blocks the bleeding, and you're protected. What happens is when the virus binds to the platelet factor 4, the body forms antibodies against that complex, and that activates the platelet factor 4. And so then you have this indiscriminate clotting because the platelet factor 4 is activated when it shouldn't be, really. Okay. And you have clots that can form anywhere in the body, and that can be dangerous, and that's what this complication is.
And not new to the scientific community, not new to our conversations, because we were getting reports of this in the early days of its use. But in the court documents, it reveals just in the UK there were 80 deaths associated with that. Is it more widespread? Is it more serious than perhaps we understood at the time?
So early on, so it wasn't seen in the trials, because something that happens in about 1 in 50,000 people is not usually going to be detected. There won't be enough of a signal in a trial, even a large trial as these trials were.
Right.
This is something you pick up in post-marketing when you have millions of doses going out and you start seeing, maybe 20 people in a million get this kind of a complication. Death from this is in that 10 to 20% range, so still high, but again, you're talking about 1 in 50,000 get it, and then a small percentage. But yes, some people died of this complication. Early on, there was a signal around, hey, maybe this is happening, and then later we got some numbers around it by around mid-2021. So, but as you said, if you go back, we're sort of, the retrospectoscope can be dangerous sometimes. You go back, we're a year into the pandemic, December of 2020, you get the first mRNA vaccines approved, and then I think by February this vaccine was approved. And this was in the UK, the first vaccine administered, big fanfare. We talked about it
British
right on this
science,
show.
Boris Johnson was going wild.
Exactly, and so this was a time when we approved all three, but the world was clamoring for vaccines. We did not, Pfizer and Moderna did not deliver mRNA to Canada. That was a big point of contention. It went to the US and it stayed in Europe.
Right.
And so this was a time where I was saying scientific consensus was get the first vaccine you can.
Available, and I did.
Yeah,
I was 2.3 million Canadians got the AstraZeneca shot. I was one of them. And you think back to that time, I'm wondering if those who also did, I mean, is there any point about being concerned about it now? Any reason to have concern if you had it way back then?
No, this is in the first 6 weeks after you get the vaccine.
Okay.
If you had it, and they're fine. Even if you had the first dose, very unlikely on the second dose, you know, maybe 2 in a million on the second dose. It was still the right thing to do, because that people forget. Now we have an immune population from vaccines and from natural infection. That was a time when the virus was much more dangerous. Everything is always about risk-benefit ratio. At that time, even with this early signal around this complication, because we didn't have mRNA vaccines and because the virus was rampant and so dangerous at the time to our population, it was still the right thing to do. That risk-benefit shifted by mid-2021 as we learned more about this, but also as we then had mRNA vaccines.
Other options.
Were better
it's
vaccines.
Such an important perspective, how it evolved at that time. Because, you know, you can appreciate, I'm hearing from viewers saying, you know, we've talked about vaccination. Those who are not in favor of vaccination, hey, Heather, did you hear about this?
It's a told you so moment
I told you
for
so.
them.
Exactly. AstraZeneca was worse than we thought at that time. So what view should we have? And I'm wondering if there's any concern about how this kind of revelation might play into what is still growing, vaccine hesitancy. We're talking about get the measles shot. We're still talking about get COVID boosters. You know, cases are going up in Alberta. We're talking about this morning. So how do we sort of frame this information in the context of we still need to be getting vaccines for other things?
Yeah, you know, I think what's important here is this played out how it should played out, how it should have played out. So new virus, you know, that we'd never seen before. Within a year, amazing scientific achievement that we had vaccines for this virus. Anytime you have a new product, whether it's a drug or a vaccine, you are going to have the potential for complications. A very rare complication was detected properly in post-marketing by monitoring what's happening with the vaccine. Very rare, and when we discovered it and identified it and measured it, we stopped distributing the vaccine. That's exactly what should happen. In the time the vaccine was used, it was still the right thing to do. 6.5 million people were saved by this vaccine in the first year after release, over 3 billion doses. Don't forget how dangerous the virus was. So everything is about risk-benefit, and that's the message. And so the message is science worked. Science developed this vaccine, saved millions of lives. Now there's a better vaccine. And yes, this vaccine had a rare complication that this better vaccine doesn't have, and therefore that better vaccine has taken over, and this is no longer something we use. But that, you know, ultimately we can't forget that the virus is worse than the vaccine, even with this complication. And that's why, you know, although there's no treatment that doesn't come with the potential for a side effect, including, you know, rare anaphylaxis, rare allergic reactions people have even to measles vaccines that have been around for decades. But you can't forget the disease itself being more dangerous than the vaccine.
Okay, that's a great point on which to conclude this week. Thank you so much for all of that. See you next Wednesday.
See you, Heather.
Thanks, Dr. Gupta.